Okay, I was looking for you. Okay, all right. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, as-salatu was-salamu ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Anybody that's with us, feel free to grab a chair, sit in a comfortable way. If you'd like to bring your chair, come close, you can do so inshallah as well. So today, does anybody know, if unless you have already seen some sort of hints or have heard me say the name, anybody knows what the name of the scholar today is? What is that? It's not Ahmad Raza Khan Barelvi. Anybody else? What is that? Albani was not Indian. He's from Delhi. Dihlawee, right. So the scholar for today, one of the history makers, his name is Qutbuddin Ahmad ibn Abdul Rahim, but he's more famously known as Shah Waliullah Ad-Dihlawee. Of course, all of this in the Urdu pronunciation is Shah Waliullah Muhaddis Dihlawee. So Shah Waliullah was born in 1703, which corresponds to 1114 of the Hijri calendar and 1703 of the Christian calendar, in the city of Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, India. He was a member of the distinguished and intellectual religious family, and his grandfather, Sheikh Wajihuddin, was a military officer under the emperors Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. So this is the grandfather of Shah Waliullah. However, the grandfather was not just a military officer known for his bravery, but also a pious and God-fearing Muslim. And his piety and God-fearingness was the hallmark of the generations of his family that came after. Wajihuddin, the grandfather, had two sons, Abdul Rida Muhammad and Shah Abdul Rahim. And both brothers distanced themselves from the court and military and pursued Islamic sciences instead. So, usually this is what happens is that, and it's a very common case, that someone achieves a lot of success in the dunya, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants them to come close to Him as well, like they become religious. And then they inspire their kids that, look, I have all the world that you can hope for already. I have it in my hands. So you go and study Islam. So they send them. So he basically allowed and sent both of his sons to go and become scholars. The younger of the two brothers, which is Shah Abdul Rahim, which is again the father of Shah Waliullah, who studied under his elder brother and other teachers, he was acknowledged throughout Delhi as a learned scholar of the highest caliber of the time. And he participated in the compilation of Al-Fatawa Alamgiriya, right? Fatawa Alamgiriya was a comprehensive legal manual to help run the affairs of the state according to the rulings of the Sharia. So basically, the average man, when they have a problem, they cannot open up the Quran and Hadith and figure out the ruling of this and that. So what the scholars would do is that they would basically say, okay, we're going to write just simple code that if this happens, you do this. We're not going to bother you with the Sharia evidences and whatnot, but here's a legal code. This is derived from the Sharia, but here is the thing. So basically, it's kind of like a legal system which was based on Quran and Sunnah. So who was involved in this? The father of Shah Waliullah in the compilation of this. So Shah Waliullah, he is born in this and he receives a highly structured education and spiritual instruction at the madrasa which was established by his father, Shah Abdul Rahim, and it was called Madrasa al-Rahimiyya. So he studies Quran there, he studies Arabic there, he studies Persian there. Okay, and it seems to me, from what I've been seeing all of his work, is that Urdu is very non-existent at the time, okay, because we're going back now almost, 300 years, right? So Urdu is still kind of in formation, so educated people, they're all speaking Persian. They're all speaking Persian. And I'm not even sure as to how many people were actually speaking Urdu at the time, although they were in India. But Persian was the main, Farsi was the main language there. So he studies Quran, he studies Arabic, he studies Persian, grammar and literature, and higher philosophy and Aqidah and fiqh and all of these other sciences. And he graduates from the school when he was barely 15 years old. When he's 15 years old, right? So basically he is a, what you would call an alim at the age of 15. At the age of 15. But remember at the same time that in that time they don't have any other school system like we have, like K to 12. So they are basically, as they're growing up, they're learning about, their main thing is like Islamic studies, and at the same time they're teaching them literature, which is non-Islamic, to kind of give them liberal arts type of curriculum as well. So whichever one, however, he basically finishes by the age of 15. And he starts to teach in his father's madrasa, which, as you would imagine, a good son starts to say, okay, Dad, you take a break, I'll take a few classes. So he starts teaching there. At this point, there's also, there's a famous Sufi order, tariqa, called Naqshbandi tariqa, which is something which is pretty normal at the time. So he's also initiated into this. But you can see later on that he actually kind of, developed his own thoughts and did not stick strictly to that. So he begins his career as a teacher in his father's madrasa, and very soon after his father passes away, and he becomes the head of the madrasa, and he starts to now teach, and he continues to teach there for 12 years. But during this time, he continues to study on his own, because you know that you graduate from medical school. You maybe get a job in a hospital as a doctor, but we all know that you don't know anything yet, right? You're just starting out right now. Same way if you become an engineer, you're just starting out. So in the same way when you become an alim, right? The guy that just graduated, he simply, probably the vast majority of the students from wherever they're graduating, at that point, their major concern is just to pass their exams. They're just passing their exams. So they're not necessarily really digesting all of the information and really practicing their hands at it. What they're really doing is, let me just get through my exams. Once I graduate, then I'll start to put everything together in my mind, okay? So, and that's a very important process to do. So he continues to teach for 12 years. But at the same time, he's studying, and things are like, okay, I'm seeing where it's going. But as he's teaching and he's studying, and this is a great combination to actually open up your mind, because if you're just studying, you don't know the problems that you would learn when you're teaching them, right? So let's say that you have been taught that the way you build a building is this way, whichever way it is. And then you become a teacher and you start teaching that theory. And students may come to you, the teacher, I tried this method several times and it has a 50% failure rate, okay? And you as a teacher, you say, well, you know what? That's a good problem, but I don't know. All I have studied is this. So I need to go and study as well. So actually teaching is actually one of the best ways of learning, because teaching helps you go and figure out the answers that have been raised in your own mind and in the minds of your questions. So he continues to do this for 12 years, growing in stature as a teacher and attracting a lot of students to his circle. But he had to face the constraints and the methodological flaws in the subcontinental scholarship that his father before him had confronted. Okay, now you might say, okay, what are the flaws, or where did these flaws come from? So think about this. If you go back 300 years from now, looking back 2020 vision, we know that Islam was already heading downwards, like as a world power, right? So there must be some problems that must have been happening all around that led to this downfall, that the scholars who are studying and they're teaching, if they are not necessarily if they're open-minded, they're going to see that, okay, this is a problem here, right? So this is going back 1703. So some of the problems, as you can imagine, during this time is in India, there is the British East India Company is coming into the picture. Okay, so they're bringing European ideas. There are also Sikh kingdoms. There are Hindu dynasties. And everybody is fighting all the time. Okay, there's like lots of changing of government that's happening, and everybody brings in a new system. When there's a new system, you question the old system, you question the new system. There's a lot of stuff going on. And India, by the way, is, I'm talking about the whole Indian subcontinent. It has actually historically been one of the richest pieces of land on earth. And think about that the British Empire, with all of its might, they considered India to be the crown jewel of the empire. And a lot of the people in the British armed forces, what they wanted was a promotion to get an appointment in India. Okay, this was the culture. And the riches that were coming from there. So now what happens is when you have a lot of wealth, okay, that wealth allows you the luxury to think about bigger ideas. When you don't have a lot of wealth, when you're just simply struggling to survive, you don't have time to think about bigger questions. You don't have time to question the tradition that has been handed down to you. So Shah Waliullah, he starts to run into these flaws. And what are some of these flaws that they came across? It is said that he felt that the Quran and Hadith were not given priority in the curriculum, even in the madaris. Okay, now what are they studying? It's not like these are Islamic madaris, but what they're studying instead of Quran is they're studying commentaries of the Quran. When they're studying Hadith, they're not studying Hadith, but they're studying it from like third or fourth perspective instead of directly studying the Hadith. And as a result, you can imagine that, what's called the concept of being lost in translation, right? That if you are reading my translation, then you're only reading what I understood. Now, what about the parts that I didn't understand at all or I didn't understand correctly? If you don't go direct to the source, you're going to miss that altogether. Okay? Now, if this keeps happening one after another, then you're going to start to feel that there is a big gap. And you think about the Bible, that's exactly what it is, that every Bible that's out there for the most part is basically a translation of a translation of a translation of a letter that was dictated to somebody who lived like 50 years after or 300 years, all that type of stuff. So basically what you have right now is that you have different versions of the Bible. Every group that claims to read it, they claim it to be the ultimate truth and the Word of God. But they all know in reality that this cannot be the Word of God because your Bible says something different than mine, and I have no verifiable way to say that mine is more authentic than yours. So both Shah Waliullah and his father felt that the decline of Islam and the scholarly tradition in the subcontinent was due to a lack of connection to the main sources, the Quran and Hadith. And of course, you can imagine that the farther you go away, the more the decline you're going to start feeling. The study of the Quran was relegated to old textbooks and super commentaries, which weakened the students' connection with the Quran itself. The study of Hadith was very weak in the subcontinent. Until that point, Indian scholars gave precedence to the study of theology. So basically, they were very concerned with, studying Aqidah, which is good, and fiqh, which is also good, but doing it so much that you're completely ignoring everything else and you're just focusing on this, it's going to cause problems because, the whole thing comes as a package. If you can get by for a little while by focusing on one and leaving the other one behind, but eventually you have to come back and you have to pick it up again. Otherwise, you're going to basically have a disbalance. So, in 1143, Shah Waliullah goes to Hajj. He goes to Hajj. So 1143. So how old would he be at this point? Anybody? He was born in 1114. and now it's almost 1144, so about 30 years, 29 years old. He goes on to Hajj. And how do you go to Hajj in those days from India? You walk to Hajj, okay, or you take a camel to Hajj, or you would take a boat to Hajj. But those boats were like, slow boats, not like today's boats. So it would take maybe like 3-4 weeks, just to 2 to 3 weeks just to arrive there, okay. And even when you go to port, you go in a boat, you would arrive at the port of Jeddah, and from Jeddah to Makkah you have to walk, okay. And you can just imagine how it is. So he goes there and he remains there for 14 months. He basically goes for one Hajj and he doesn't come back until the Hajj after. So he does 2 Hajj in one trip, and during that time he stays there and he starts to study hadith from the scholars in the Hijaz. He starts to engage in discussions. It's like, okay, well, you're a scholar here, I'm a scholar there. Over there, this is what we do. Why do I see you doing different? So he says, well, the reason why we do it is this and this and this and this. So this type of intellectual, respectful discussion is actually, as you can all imagine, is very beneficial to broaden your horizons. Okay, like we are doing something there. What are you doing here? So, and he does a lot of tafakkur while over there, like you're thinking about, okay, and you can imagine, like, all of us, if many of us, we come from different countries. When we come to America, we are forced to question some of the things that we were doing back home, right? We are forced to question some of the practices that we were doing back home. Small little things like, even like the setup of our masajid is different here than it is back home. Okay, one of the things you might think, I don't know how it is in Egypt. Do Egyptian masajid have place for women in the masjid? Yes? Okay. So in Pakistan, no place for women in the masjid. Okay, I have not seen any of the masajid that I have been. Maybe if there's like a government-built masjid or something, they might have some space, which is more of a tourist masjid, not a regular masjid. But, there's no space for women at all. I'm not talking about like a back room. There's not even a back room, okay? It just says that, what are you doing here, lady? Go home and pray. So when you come to America, you are forced to like, okay, every masjid has space for women. So now, which one is right? Is this the right way or is that the right way? You're forced to think that unless you're like completely blind and you don't see anything. So in the same way, when he goes to Hijaz and he speaks to the scholars over there, he starts to learn from them and he starts to, think that, okay, what practices they have that are right and what practices we have that are right. So his objective was to gain authorizations in the transmission of hadith from reputable hadith masters and broaden his intellectual horizons. So, there's one quote that just came to my mind, and it says that whoever did not travel is like a person who only read the cover of the book. Okay, so you just read the cover of the book because you only lived in your town, your city, you only studied there, you only knew what was going on there. Now when you travel, you get to read the other pages and you get to actually see, okay, what else is out there in the world. And then sometimes you come back and say, you know what, alhamdulillah, what we have is better. And sometimes you come back, most of the times you come back and you say, we have some good things and they have some good things that we can bring back home as well. So during this time, I was actually trying to get my hands on this book called Fuyud al-Haramain, or Fuyuz al-Haramain in Urdu, which is that while he was there, he had 47 dreams. So he wrote about all of those dreams in his journal, which was then published as this, which is Fuyud al-Haramain. So I was actually searching for this book. If anybody finds it, please send me a link. So he has, basically what we call an epiphany, a mind-opening type of experience. And after making the second Hajj, Shah Waliullah returns home to Delhi in 1144. And he spent the rest of his life teaching hadith literature and writing, and all but one or two of his works were produced during his later years. All but one or two of his works were produced during the later years, meaning most of his books were written after he came back from the Hijaz, not before. Now, some of his intellectual and philosophical contributions. Number one is that it is believed that he was the first person to translate the Quran from Arabic to Persian, the first Indian scholar to do this during that time. And I actually was looking up all the history of translations of the Quran in Persian language. And there is nothing for a few hundred years before him. So as you can imagine, a translation which is, even if there is one, if it's like 400 or 500 years old, imagine like reading an English translation that was done 500 years ago. It would be so difficult to read. So during his time, one of the first things that he did is that he translated the Quran in Persian so that the average person in the Indian subcontinent can read the Quran, can read, basically, of course, they cannot still read the Quran directly, but they can get as close to it as possible instead of reading a commentary of a translation of the Quran, but bring them that much closer. He published 50 to 70 works, including 5 collections of letters and messages that he received. And you know that many of the great scholars in the past, just like today, you get a lot of emails, right? And you answer those emails on those issues. So what they would do is that they would basically make a copy of it, and they would keep a copy for the record, and they would send one out so that in case somebody came and said, hey, you wrote such and such thing in your letter, and let's say they had changed something, so you needed to have an original copy of your own letter. So they would keep a copy on their record, and then they would send one out. So eventually what their students would do is that they would take those letters and they would publish them in the form of a book. And that also tells you about what was going on in his mind, what he was talking about. So Shah Waliullah, he was very good in bringing together different viewpoints. He was basically, you could say, a very knowledgeable and wise diplomat of a spiritual nature, that there are different views and he's able to bring them together without upsetting any of them and finding a way through the problems. So there are a bunch of books that he wrote. I'm not going to give you all the details about them. One of them is called Al-Khair Al-Kathir. One of them is called Al-Taf Al-Qudus fi Ma'rifat Lata'if al-Nafs, fi Ma'rifat Lata'if al-Nafs. And also his great book, I was actually finding that a lot of these scholars until today, they say that this is one of the greatest books that have been written on the subject, and it is called Hujjatullah al-Baligha. Hujjatullah al-Baligha. And this is a book which talks about a lot of the greater questions about Aqidah, about where do we come from, the early creation and things like that. And then the second part of it is devoted to ethics like manners, politics, rituals, and social life of Islam. Also, another one of his books, okay, I'm going to just study and skip them. Inshallah, you can go and search the names if you're interested. Now, Shah Waliullah actually started a movement, and he's actually considered a reformer of a scholar, So Shah Waliullah, he tried to provide a basis for bringing the 4 schools of law closer to each other. Okay, one of the things that we had during this time was that you might have seen a picture, even in Mecca, that there was a time when there were 4 different jama'at going on. Okay, so the Hanafis did not pray behind the Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali. And each of the schools, they were so bogged down that they had basically kind of internal strife with each other. And they would say that it's not allowed. If you are a Hanbali, your salah is invalid behind a Hanafi imam. Okay? And this was a problem that Shah Waliullah faced as well. And he tried to provide a basis. He said, look, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. So he wrote a number of books in this particular matter, which is to try to resolve the strife between madhahib. And he wrote a commentary on Muwatta of Imam Malik. And he actually wrote two of them, one in Arabic, which was called Musawwa, and one in Persian, which is called Musaffa. And they were written with a view to finding common orthodox ground for the reconciliation of the different schools of thought, right? He's saying that basically, every school of thought is trying to understand what the Prophet ﷺ taught us, right? Now, basically, the essence of this argument is that, okay, a certain school of thought had this opinion, but now we have found an authentic hadith on this matter, which is contradicted by this opinion. So doesn't it make sense that we can, respectfully disregard that opinion of a scholar and go with the opinion of the teacher of all of the scholars, which is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he also criticized the concept of blind following. Okay, and he said that so the concept of taqleed is a thing where, for an average person who doesn't know Quran and Sunnah, of course you have no option but to follow a scholar. Right? So all of us, we look at major scholars and we say, okay, you know what? This is my mufti. I'm going to go with him. I don't understand Quran. I don't understand hadith. I don't understand fiqh. But I trust this person. This is the person that I'm going to follow. But then, that's okay. And all of the scholars, they say that for an average person, you have to do this. You have no other choice. You cannot open a book of hadith without having even the basic understanding of how hadith is to be understood and say, you know what, this is how I'm going to pray from now on, or this is how I'm going to do such and such. So, one of my teachers, one day, one of our friends, he went up to him and he challenged him. He said, Sheikh, you said such and such, and there's a hadith in this book that says such and such. So the Shaykh looked at him. He said, okay, where's that hadith? He said, show me. So, the hadith said, qala, if you remember in our hadith class, we discussed that when a hadith is narrated, there's a way that you can tell as to how this hadith was heard, okay? Some of the narrators, they say that the Prophet said, okay? In which case, we don't know if they heard it directly from the Prophet ﷺ, or if they had, like Umar radiallahu anh had a companion, and one day Umar used to work, and one day his companion used to work, and at nighttime they used to gather and they used to tell, this is what the Prophet said today. Now, if there's a hadith narrated by Umar and he's saying, Qala Rasulullah, so in this case, it could be that he heard it directly, or it could be that his companion told him, okay? There's another type of narration where the narrator, the companion says, Sami'tu Rasulullah, I heard with my own ears from the Prophet ﷺ. So whenever there is a contradiction between two reports, and one of them says qala, one of them says the Prophet said so and so, the other one says I heard the Prophet saying this, then this is one way that you give a preference to the one which was heard firsthand. Okay, so the Shaykh just said to him, he said, look, this narration that you are bringing up, it is a weaker narration in terms of strength of authority from the other narration in which the narrator said, I heard the Prophet directly. Okay, so there are different issues like that the average man does not understand. And he might pick up a book of hadith and think that he is now a muhaddith because he has a book of hadith and he starts to come up with his own stuff. So the average man has to do that. Now Shah Waliullah said that this is not allowed for scholars. This is not allowed for scholars. Scholars can't just copy and paste when they know that there is another narration. They know that it's authentic. In that case, they need to practice, what you call critical thinking. And maybe there was a mistake in the process that arrived at that ruling, whatever the case was, without disrespecting anybody. The scholar has to have his eyes open. The scholar cannot do blind following. Now, of course, the ulama of the time, not just in the Indian subcontinent, but in many places in the world, this was one of the things that was really bogging them down, and they were not really open to thinking about new ways of solving problems. And if you remember, we discussed in the story of the printing press, right? When the invention of printing press came around, the vast majority of the Muslim scholars of the world, they consider it to be a clear danger to Islam, which is, basically what people are thinking right now about Chat GPT, right? That everybody is thinking that, this is going to mess up everything, because now the average person will have as much knowledge as a scholar. But the reality is, it will never be like that. It's really difficult for it to reach there at any time soon. It's not going to happen. It will take some time. But perhaps we need to come up with some constraints around that, okay, this is how much artificial intelligence could go. And that's what a lot of the people who are thinking in this field are saying, that look, ChatGPT and other type of artificial intelligence stuff is good, but we need to put some boundaries around it as to where it can go, where it cannot go, and where it should not go. So one of the things that Shah Waliullah, he argued for, he said that, look, we need to open the door to ijtihad. Okay, the door to ijtihad. Now, what does that mean? That means that up until now, the scholars of the time, they say, look, nobody can do ijtihad anymore. This is not acceptable. We have enough writings of scholars. We have enough Quran and Hadith there. We have, at this point, this is 1703. So basically, we have about 1,200 or 1,100 years worth of writings. So there's no need for anybody to come up with any new fatwa. You can't. Okay? But he said that no, this is wrong, because each time and each generation needs its own ijtihad. Because if you don't, you're going to run into a problem. You're going to become outdated. You're going to become, there's an old fatwa, which is a very, very good fatwa for its time. Okay, that fatwa was given during this time when Indian Muslims and Hindus were living together. And then on top of that was the British influence pushing on them. Okay, so you could not tell a difference in the street between a Muslim and a Hindu. So, Brother Mukeet, can you stand up, please? So the scholars of the time, they gave a fatwa that every Muslim needs to dress like that. They need to wear a kurta and shalwar, or this pajama, okay, as opposed to a lungi. They said that, you can sit down, thank you. They said that a Muslim needs to be unique and distinguished from the Hindus that are living next to them, right? The Hindus are wearing, lungi and other type of stuff, very similar, but they said that we need to have something that you could see two people coming down the street, the Muslim should look like a Muslim, okay? So they gave a fatwa, very good fatwa, a very, wise fatwa in order to protect the identity. But now this fatwa was given 200-300 years ago, right? Now, there are people who are in 2023 in America copying the same fatwa and saying that this is the Islamic clothing. Okay, and that's where the problem comes, where if you don't can say, well, okay, we need to figure out what is the Islamic-based clothing that can kind of coincide with the culture that we're living in, but at the same time fulfill the purpose of the Islamic dress code as well. Okay, so maybe a little bit longer shirts, looser pants, things like that, which fulfill the purpose of Islamic dress guidelines, but at the same time, they're not, so backward, so different than when people see us in the street, they say, oh, these are some other foreigners. These are not, because the thing is that Islam takes root in a country where the people say, okay, Islam is here to stay. And as long as we dress, in a foreign dress, the people, they look at us and they say, yeah, these people are here, and they will leave at one point, right? They don't consider it to be, it's not really meshing in. Now, we are allowed to get mixed in, but we need to maintain our own unique identity. We need to maintain our own unique identity. And I encourage all the brothers, by the way, that sometimes it's out of our control. Maybe we're coming from somewhere, but we should all try to wear longer shirts. Okay, even when we're wearing pants, wear shirts which kind of go below your, and I'm talking to the brothers here specifically, go below your midsection. Okay, so ideally, I think they should not be tucked in, because when they're tucked in, then it gets, too much of an exposition. So we should try to wear longer shirts. There are different styles out there. You have these button shirts, which are kind of loose. Some of them are rounded at the bottom. Some of them are straight at the bottom. So you can come up with your own design, but that way it will, when we make our salah, we're not worried if our salah is being accepted or not. Okay? And those are things where you won't feel like a person from Mars if you happen to need to go to like Walmart or shopping or something like that, but rather you can kind of adapt the American style within the Islamic style as well. So anyways, Shah Waliullah, he said that we need to open the door to ijtihad. And we need to address the problems of today with the principles of Islam, but the implementation of today. Okay, we need to see what's going on right now, look at what Islamic principles are, and we need to maybe put aside the fatwa which were given for Andalus, the fatwa which were given for Hijaz, and we need to look at our situation right now, and we need to see how we can localize Islam here by staying true to the tradition, but also holding on to the situation that we are in. Of course, what happens is, if in America, if you're going to tell your kids you have to wear shalwar kameez, okay, what's going to happen is that your kids are going to rebel against the shalwar kameez. And if they equate in their mind that shalwar kameez represents Islam, because that's the idea that you have been giving them, then they are going to rebel against Islam as well in their mind. Okay. So, according to him, the experts of Islamic knowledge, which is the ulama and the mujtahideen, have the right to respond effectively to new situations instead of being perpetually bound by previous solutions. Okay, and this is called fiqh an-nawazil. Fiqh an-nawazil, which is how do you deal with new issues that arise. First, of course, you have to search for the Quran. Maybe there's some basis of it, right? The invention of car comes around. So what are the rules of driving a car? You would look at, what were the rules associated with driving a camel in the time, and see if there's anything that you can, take as an analogy and derive lessons from that, right? By the way, there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that the one who's riding should greet the one who is walking, right? And the one who is walking should greet the one who is it sitting or standing? The one who is walking should greet the one who is sitting. So how does that greeting matter? So basically, if your job is to greet that person, it means you are on a camel. You can kill that person if you don't pay attention. So you need to acknowledge him and you need to greet him. Okay, so basically the rite of passage, even in American, in the Western law, I don't know if that's a law, but in the tradition, the rite of passage is given to the weaker one, okay? If you are driving a car and somebody else is walking, the walking person has preference over the guy who's in a car. If it's a car versus a truck, right, the truck can crush the car. So you get the point. Now, Shah Waliullah, he lived in a time when the Mughal empire was also facing a decline. And he was someone who was expert at, connecting different groups and uniting them. So when he saw the political and moral decline and chaos and destruction in the Mughal Empire, he started to see what he could do to address it. And many of his letters, they show that he was very well aware of what's going on, and he was talking to different people, writing letters to them, trying to raise attention. Hey, pay attention to this and this area. Through his writings, especially his letters, he appealed to Muslim rulers. Okay, so he has letters that he was writing to the rulers, the nobles, the intelligentsia, to be aware of the dreadful situation and its possible consequences. So he's saying that, hey, I am seeing such and such thing happening, and if you don't stop it now, the effect of this down the road is going to be this. So please address it right now. Please address it right now. He wrote a letter to Ahmad Shah Abdali, also known as Ahmad Shah Durrani, who was the founder and the ruler of Afghanistan at the time. Founder, I don't know, maybe some Afghanis might disagree with me. But he was a ruler at the time in the Afghanistan region. And he painted for him a comprehensive picture of the political situation in India. And he said that, please, can you come and invade India? Because he said, this is the situation. The Mughals are weak, and the other forces are on our doorsteps, but they also have weaknesses that are stronger than the Mughals, but they are still weaker than you. So since you are a Muslim, and if we don't do anything about it, these people will come and they will shove Hinduism down our throats. So why don't you come and take over this area? So actually, Ahmad Shah, which ruler doesn't like a letter like this, right? So he heeded the warnings of Shah Waliullah, and he came and he actually invaded this area, and he restored Muslim power to the country, culminating in the defeat of the Marathas. Marathas was a rising Hindu force, and their allies at the famous Battle of Panipat in 1761. Shah Waliullah, he left a rich and intellectual legacy in the form of books and well-trained disciples, including his 4 sons. And all of his 4 sons, they became great scholars themselves, and they established one of the greatest institutions, which was the madrasa that he was teaching at first. They basically, continued to grow it and grow it. And he had a son whose name was Shah Abdul Aziz Muhaddith Dihlawee, like his father, Shah Waliullah Muhaddith Dihlawee. And this son had a son whose name was Shah Abdul Qadir. And Shah Abdul Qadir wrote the first Urdu translation of the Quran in 1826. Okay, so like grandfather, like grandson. So his grandfather translated the Quran in Persian, so he translated the Quran in Urdu, because of course now Urdu is on the rise and people are speaking it, and now they're not able to understand the Persian and the Arabic Quran, so they need to be able to read it. He died in 1762, which corresponds to 1175. Shah Waliullah, he rejuvenated the study of hadith in the Indian subcontinent, and he started a movement which is now called the Ahl al-Hadith movement, which basically says that, hey, madhahib are not bad, but we cannot be following the opinion of a scholar when there is a clear hadith which is authentic, which has now reached us. We have to, of course, ignore the opinion of any scholar. As Imam Malik rahimahullah, he said that every scholar, you take some and you leave some, except the man in that grave, pointing to the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And now, of course, this movement is not a perfect movement. His vision was a very conciliatory tone. He was not saying that, okay, you know what, all of you guys are bad now. But nowadays, especially I can say in Pakistan, you have different groups and they're all at arms with each other, right? They're all at, weapons up against each other. And unfortunately, in the area that I am from and when I visit, people don't go to other masajid. They only go to a masjid of their, you could say, subgroup. So they'll say that this is a Ahl Hadith masjid. We don't go here, we go to this Deobandi masjid or this Brailwi masjid. And I'm like, you know what, we come from America. For us, we are so happy to see any masjid that we can go and pray. But for them, it is a very serious thing that no, you only go to the masjid of your own. And anytime if you say something, they're like, oh, you're Ahl Hadith, right? So as soon as they can stick a label on you, they say, okay, I can now completely ignore anything this guy has to say because I have now labeled him. He's from a different school, so I don't have to listen to him because I'm not from that school, right? And that is something which we all know is, producing a very detrimental situation where we all feel that in terms of the enthusiasm for deen is very low in these areas, right? And the enthusiasm of especially the younger generation is even lower. And a lot of our youngsters, they are more impressed and they think that success will come from following Western ideas, okay? So they are following everything on internet and they are adopting all of that culture, but their connection to Islam, their connection to their identity, and their you could say relationship with the great, amazing tradition that we have has become so weak. And part of it is because they have seen their scholars and imams bickering with each other and giving fatwa against each other. There is a famous a story that there was this one imam in a village. He was from a particular, you could say, what's the word that I'm looking for? Maktabah fikr, right? A school of thought. So this imam was out of town, and someone died in that village. So they had to do a janazah. So nobody knew how to do a janazah. So they said, the only imam that we have is this other masjid. But this imam is from a different school of thought. Okay, I'm not going to mention the name. So let's bring him. And these are all, they are not outside of the mainstream Islam. Okay, they are within. They have differences within them, but they are, all within the Sunni branch of Islam. So they brought him to come and lead the janazah prayer. So when the main imam came back, he said, "What? You guys prayed janazah behind him?" He said, "Every single person who prayed janazah behind him, your nikah has been invalidated." Okay? Your nikah has been invalidated, and everybody needs to come, bring your wife here, and I will do a new nikah between you and your wife. And this is apparently a true story. And, unfortunately, there are sad stories like that out there. If only these people could come to America, come to the West, and they could see the attacks on Islam that we are going through, that they would say, you know what, let's go back and everybody hug and let's forget about these differences. There's so much worse stuff going on outside that we need to deal with. Let's not fight among ourselves. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the tawfiq to learn from the beautiful example of Shah Waliullah. He was someone that was a scholar, and he basically was a reformer in the sense that he said, no, we cannot continue to just copy and paste. We need to look at the situations, and we need to come up with a new solution based on the Quran and Hadith. Okay, everything else in the middle, it was good for their time and their place, but now we need to look at it. And until today, some of the most, you could say, effective scholars in terms of the amount of benefit that they're able to bring to the masses are those people who actually have this approach, which is that, okay, copy and paste is good in ibadat. Our salah will always remain the same. But in terms of our interactions, our dealings in our businesses and things like that, we have to take a fresh look based on the principles, not the fatwa of the previous generations. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Do we have any questions or comments or clarifications? If anybody wants to add anything that you know about that I didn't mention, yes, brother. So it is said that it is the first Persian translation by an Indian scholar in the Indian subcontinent area. So I looked into this matter as well. I said, you know what, is it really the first? Because Farsi and the Persian language has been incorporated within the Islamic empire way earlier. So it is said that Salman al-Farisi, radiyallahu anh, the companion, he was the first person to translate some part of the Quran in Arabic, and some say that he only translated Surah al-Fatiha, and some say that he did more. And then at other time, I believe it is At-Tabari, that he also translated the Quran in Persian. But of course, I looked at the time span, and it's like hundreds of years in between them. And I couldn't find anything that was, closely at the time. So we could say that definitely it was needed at the time that he did it. So I tell you that translation of the Quran is always controversial, okay? Because it's a very, very touchy subject. And until today, we have, sometimes we have Tom, Dick, and Harry picks up the Quran and he says, I'm going to translate the Quran. The thing is that you have to have, when you work on this, number one, you have to have your own solid credentials. A lot of our people nowadays, basically what they do is that their Arabic is very weak. Their, Islamic sciences are very weak. They maybe just read a few books here and there. What they do is that they pick up like 17 different English translations, and they say, I'm going to pick the easiest words, and I'm going to put together a new translation, okay? Now, it sounds like a good idea to kind of make the language easy, but the thing is that translators, if they understand the Arabic, they need to be careful as to what word they're choosing, because the words can have a lot of impact, right? It could have implications. So if you choose one word over the other, it could really do something. So, na'udhu billah, there's even someone who said, you know what, all of this Quran translations have been done by men, and nothing has been done by a woman. So a woman who has zero Islamic qualifications, zero Arabic language, she said, I'm going to translate the Quran as the first female translated Quran. Okay, so there's they do that. Now, if a person wants to go on this, usually what used to happen is that senior scholars would say to a student, they would say, look, student, I have taught you all of what I knew, but I don't understand the language that you come from. But you have understood, and I am confident in your ability to understand the Quran properly. So I'm giving you permission to translate the Quran in your language. So usually you need to have some sort of authority from previous major scholars. Say, you know what, we feel that you are qualified enough to do such a thing. And then even after they do it, then they have to take it, in academic research, they call it peer reviewed, right? So if you ever somebody comes and says, look, I have done a translation of the Quran, before you read the translation, go and look at who has given reviews for this. Okay? If it's like your average Tom, Dick, and Harry and says, I've been reading so many translations and this was the best, it doesn't matter what Tom, Dick, and Harry think. What matters is what do some of the scholars of our time think about this hadith, this translation. If they say yes, and one of the recent translations that has been done and has been widely accepted and praised by many scholars is the Clear Quran by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, who is a person that I personally know. He's a graduate of Azhar University, very qualified person, and very good in English language, and has done one of the best, most recent translations of the Quran that young people can pick up, new Muslims can pick up, and they can read and they could benefit from that. But he has the backing of major scholars, and no one has criticized him because he has the credentials for doing so. But somebody just gets up and does a translation, that's when the controversy comes, and that's rightfully so. Any other questions? Yes. Even before, you could say that the period of stagnation in the ummah was basically about, you could say, the last, after the first few hundred years, maybe 100 or 200 years of Ottoman Empire. That was the dominant power, and Islam started to go down due to the stagnation in our distance from Quran and Hadith, generally speaking, right? There was always, few sprinkles here and there, but the vast majority basically got bogged down in just copy and pasting and closing the door to ijtihad and addressing new problems in a new way. Allahu alam. There's a book on this, so if you read about it, it's called Tarikh al-Tashri', or the history of legislation. If anybody is interested, inshallah, I can give you, so you can read how it started from the time of the Prophet, how ijtihad was done by the Sahaba in the time of the Prophet, how the Sahaba after the Prophet practiced ijtihad, and each generation after, until a time came when they said the door to ijtihad is closed. And now, we are now living in an age where many scholars are saying, no, this is wrong, and we need to reopen the door to ijtihad in order to keep Islam up to date, based on the original principles, but up to date with modern times and modern places. Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Last one. Any sisters? Yes, brother. So Shah Waliullah, if you read his books, so basically, there is a physical attack that comes, and there's also an intellectual attack that comes. So Shah Waliullah, his books are filled with fortifications for the Muslim against the intellectual attacks. So once you give the intellectual fortification, then the next thing you have to do is you have to tell the rulers who are able to do the physical fortifications that, hey, we have nothing to be afraid of. We are strong, we are upon the truth. Stay firm and protect against this. So this was, in my understanding, the approach of Shah Waliullah. And of course, with inviting the ruler of Afghanistan to come and invade this part in order to protect them and give them help against the Maratha forces that were right on the doorsteps. Okay. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفر